Welcome to this April session of the Woolf Post Kantian Philosophy Seminar. Today, our speaker is Mr. Brett Carollo of the Rice University Department of Religion. Brett's currently completing a PhD, the title of which is Transhumanism and the Religion of Apotheosis. And the paper he's going to be delivering today, I understand, is a selection from that dissertation, which will be appearing in print later this year in the fall issue of the Journal for Continental Philosophy of Religion. In addition to his doctoral work at Rice University, Brett is also one of the co-hosts, along with Thomas Millery, of the Psyop Cinema podcast. He's also a founder of the Decoding Culture Foundation, and he's also editor-in-chief of a publication associated with that foundation, a magazine which is entitled Cultural Engineering Studies. And it's my understanding that the inaugural issue of that magazine will be appearing sometime in the summer. So without further ado, I'd like to hand things over to Brett.
Thank you, Stephen. And yes, indeed, I'm going to be reading from a paper that it will be published in a forthcoming issue of the Journal of the Continental Philosophy of Religion. And I'm going to share screen so you can see the paper. It is titled Nietzsche and the Mysticism of Apotheosis. I'll go ahead and read the abstract. To kind of get us oriented, I might explain a few terms, but basically I'm just going to read the text. This paper argues that Friedrich Nietzsche was a mystic and that his post-gay science 1882 thought should be understood as an unfolding expression of his mystical experiences. Drawing on Nietzsche's Nachlass, letters, and published writings, I show that he undoubtedly had at least two major mystical experiences, and that these experiences were the source of all the cardinal motifs of his later thought. The apparent tensions or paradoxes between Nietzsche's cardinal teachings, above all that between the Superman and the eternal recurrence, are resolved once they are understood as products of a mystical epistemology derived from an intuitive source of knowledge purportedly beyond the dualities intrinsic to ordinary modes of cognition. And that kind of mouthful is what the paper is about breaking down. This Intuitio Mystica, which Nietzsche declared to be the real purpose of all philosophy, is coextensive with the type of mysticism I call apotheosis, term I got from Karl Roschka and others, based on the individual ego's identification with a unity underlying all reality. So there's the title again, and I'll start with the introduction. Friedrich Nietzsche is a notoriously difficult to classify thinker, having influenced a variety of more or less incompatible intellectual movements, from existentialism and post-structuralism to psychoanalysis and transhumanism. He has been claimed by the farthest right and the farthest left, and he has inspired artists and musicians, as well as maniacs and despots. That he can be at once so protean and so provocative is not merely the byproduct of a literary style out of step with the conventions of philosophical discourse, however. It is, as his most perspicacious interpreters have recognized, a function of the basic character of his thought. While philosophers in the traditional pre-postmodern sense are concerned above all with truth, Nietzsche questioned the very value of truth, the culmination of a project to revalue all values. Yet, as Paul Loeb correctly observes, it is impossible to deny that Nietzsche was simultaneously very interested in truth and proof. In this paper, I argue that the paradoxical quality of Nietzsche's thought, and in particular its epistemology, arises from the fact that the main source of this thought is not in the intellect or rational faculty, but in something that announces itself as transcending the categories of human reason and providing direct, intuitive access to the inner nature of reality. That is to say, I argue that Nietzsche was a mystic. Specifically, I argue that his philosophy is the expression of a form of mysticism that I call apotheosis, which is characterized by the desire to divinize the individual self. Following a brief survey of previous mystical readings of Nietzsche, I consider the mystical epistemology underlying his later thought in the context of a shift occurring in the study of religion around the turn of the 20th century. The man most responsible for that shift was William James, who sought to vindicate direct experience and the intuition as sources of knowledge. I apply James's classical psychological typology for identifying mystical experience to two of Nietzsche's most intense experiences. But I also develop a subtypology that reconciles Nietzsche's mystical outlook with its professed atheism and physicalism, while accounting for some of its other peculiar features, like its equating of knowledge and deification. Finally, I demonstrate that a mystical understanding of Nietzsche is indispensable to reconciling the supposed contradiction between his two preeminent teachings, the eternal recurrence and the Superman. Mystical interpretations of Nietzsche. Several commentators have discerned in Nietzsche's writings intimations of mystical experience. In a short paper published in 1954, for example, Columbia philosophy professor James Gutman, excuse any mispronunciations throughout the paper, tentatively classifies the events of August 1881, that is the extraordinary experience Nietzsche describes in passages from his published writings and letters, which I quote at length below, as a religious experience, however heterodox, or perhaps more accurately as a kind of mystical experience. More generally, several authors, beginning with Nietzsche's one-time companion Lou Salome, have stressed to varying degrees the transrational character of his thought or the role of visionary experience in its formation. Until the last decade of the 20th century, most of these commentators were French, including Charles Ondler and Daniel Halevi. What I'm proposing, however, is not merely that certain features of Nietzsche's thought are mystical or otherwise bear the imprint of personal mystical experience. Rather, I'm making the stronger claim that Nietzsche's mature, post-1881 thought is fundamentally mystical, and that he therefore ought to be understood primarily as a mystic in contradistinction to a philosopher. Only a handful of prominent thinkers have advanced such a fully mystical interpretation of Nietzsche. The most significant of these, in terms of my own interpretation, is that of French Jesuit theologian Henri de Lubac, contained in his 1950 essay Nietzsche as Mystic, which is appended to later editions of The Drama of Atheist Humanism, first published in French in 1944. In the latter, de Lubac already detects behind the purported atheism of Nietzsche and other modern philosophers more than the mere rejection of God, but rather an anti-theist impulse, aiming at the self-divinization of the individual human as a replacement for God. Drawing on the previous contributions of Ondler, Salome, and Halevi, along with Armand Queneau, Nietzsche as Mystic opens with an examination of the breakthrough mystical experience of August 1881, alongside a second major mystical experience in 1883 in Rapallo, Italy, which we'll also talk about. Beyond the recognition that Nietzsche's thought was touched by extraordinary ecstatic experiences, however, de Lubac appreciates that these experiences, or rather the content of these experiences, became the epistemological foundation of all his subsequent thought. Additionally, he demonstrates how a mystical interpretation of Nietzsche resolves what many philosophic critics see as tensions or contradictions in his thought. Above all, the supposed contradiction between the eternal recurrence and the Superman. In later sections, I develop these key insights within a typological analysis of Nietzschean mysticism. Georges Bataille, another Frenchman writing around the same time, also treats Nietzsche as basically a religious thinker in his 1945 book, Sur Nietzsche, published in English as On Nietzsche. That same year, Bataille published a collection of passages from Nietzsche under the title Memorandum, the fourth and final section of which carries the heading Mystical States. This section, explains Jim Urpeth, consists almost entirely of texts Bataille regarded as positive biographical reports of the exalted states and moods of Nietzsche's enraptured experience of immanence. Bataille thereby seeks to present Nietzsche's thought as imbued with and grounded in a profoundly religious disposition akin to his own. While Bataille and Sir Nietzsche engages his subject primarily as a vehicle for his own approach to mysticism, he also explores some of the genuinely mystical aspects of Nietzsche's writings. Like de Lubac, Bataille is heavily influenced by the Catholic mystic tradition, though his own heterodox style of mysticism, which revolves around taboo eroticism, is much closer to Nietzsche's than it is to the Catholic mystics. Both Nietzsche and Bataille advocate a naturalistic as opposed to otherworldly mysticism, a mysticism of immanence rather than the transcendent. Bataille is especially interested in Nietzsche's death of God, which, according to Urpeth, he takes to be an inherently religious event within the historical manifestation of the sacred, whereby it jettisons the guise of the transcendent. For de Lubac, too, Nietzsche's mysticism is defined by its radical immanence. In contrast to Bataille, however, he rejects this type of mysticism as a mysticism of replacement, by which Nietzsche sought unsuccessfully to fill the dreadful emptiness that had opened up in him as a result of the death of God. De Lubac, again in direct contrast to Bataille, regards the latter as a wholly negative experience, the death of God as a wholly negative experience, insisting that only a Christian mysticism can satisfy the primordial desire for God. Such a mystical evaluation of Nietzsche's mysticism is not possible in this study, but de Lubac and Bataille are both correct in singling out this radical immanentizing tendency as the most distinctive feature of Nietzsche's mysticism, and in seeing his atheism as largely a disguise for this. More recently, religious scholar Jeffrey Kripal has drawn the same conclusion, namely that Nietzsche was not really an atheist in any conventional sense, but rather a godless mystic. Kripal, trained in the so-called Chicago School of Religious Comparativism led by Mircea Eliade, examines the aforementioned biographical reports through the lens of what he calls new comparativism, to which my own approach here is indebted. This method involves comparing paranormal and altered state experiences, along with the cultural and intellectual productions that result from these experiences, with reports of extraordinary mystical and religious experiences from the past. In this case, Kripal compares Nietzsche's reported experiences with two historical literatures whose experiences and expressions strike me as quite similar to his own: global mystical literature and modern paranormal literature. He concludes, as I do, that these reports bear all the hallmarks of what many religious scholars commonly classify as mystical experience. At the heart of Nietzsche's mysticism, according to Kripal, is the evolution of the superhuman, the latter being a modern expression of the perennial mystical goal of deification, as Nietzsche confirms by his own claims of godhood. This modern form of superhumanism is intimately related to the concept of apotheosis I introduced below, although I can only indicate these connections in a preliminary way within the space provided. Finally, Australian philosopher Andrew Milne's first monograph, published in 2021, entitled Nietzsche as Egoist and Mystic, situates Nietzsche in a supposed mystical lineage that includes Heraclitus, Empedocles, Spinoza, and Goethe, figures Nietzsche names in a note as his ancestors. As Milne admits, Nietzsche elsewhere speaks of a mystical ancestry encompassing Zarathustra, Moses, Mohammed, Jesus, Plato, and others, but he contends that Nietzschean mysticism must be studied outside of the comparative context of Christian and Buddhist traditions. The key to it, according to Milne, lies in the paradoxical union of mysticism and egoism that other scholars have often misunderstood. As I indicate below, Milne's attempt to reconcile this apparent tension in Nietzsche's thought is, like Kripal's superhumanism, closely related to my concept of apotheosis. So we begin with an introduction to the concept of mysticism, which is important, I think, to a non-religious studies audience. So mysticism is a highly controversial category within the study of religion. The Greek roots of the term mystikos, meaning secret, from the verb muo, meaning to close or to conceal, were first used with reference to the ancient mystery religions, and they would go on to be used extensively in early Christian writings, beginning with St. Paul. There's much debate, however, whether any consistent underlying concept is attached to the word as it is used in these ancient contexts. As a substantive, the term mysticism appears for the first time in English usage in 1736, coined by Henry Coventry to differentiate false religion, consisting in overheated and irrational ecstasies and enthusiasm, from religion proper, which he conceived as a sober, rational, public-spirited affair worthy of Enlightenment intellectuals. This pejorative usage would prevail until the end of the 19th century, when Romanticism, with its revalorization of the instinctual and subjective, had in many ways eclipsed the Enlightenment spirit of rationality among the Western intelligentsia. The turning point was William James's Varieties of Religious Experience, 1902, in which mysticism, far from being a corrupted deviation from true religion, is treated as the core and foundation of all religion. Influenced by the American transcendentalists and other liberal religionists of the 19th century, James sought to shift the emphasis in the study of religion away from traditions and institutions and place it squarely in the domain of subjective experience. This historical shift, writes William Parsons, authorized an unchurched usage of the term, universalizing and democratizing it, whereas critics of mysticism in the 18th and 19th centuries associated it with Christian sectarianism. It would become synonymous with universalism or perennialism, with the personal quest for a spiritual absolute that is the ground for all formal or traditional religions, even as it transcends them. The concept of mysticism, then, may be said to constitute the wedge by which spirituality has been divided from religion, a division that has produced the spiritual but not religious category. Underlying this great scholarly and spiritual shift is an epistemology that, following Friedrich Schleiermacher, privileges direct experience and intuitive knowledge over tradition and discursive reasoning. In the words of Michel de Certeau, necessarily estranged from more secularized global institutions and rapidly shrinking church institutions. The lived sense of the absolute, the universal God, found its privileged indices, internal or external, in phenomena of consciousness. Lived experience became the sign and punctuation of the perception of the infinite. Like the earlier critics of mysticism, James associated it with the feelings or intuition in contradistinction to reason. But James turned the critics on their heads, arguing that the unreasoned and immediate assurance is the deep thing in us, while the reasoned argument is but a surface exhibition. In a word, our mystical intuitions fix our beliefs beforehand. My purpose here is not to argue for or against this epistemology or how it has been used to sever mysticism from traditional religion. Traditional religionists who also value mystical experience do not have to accept the Jamesian mystical epistemology wholesale. They can simply posit that there are true and false mysticisms, that is, mystical experiences and knowledge that are either consistent or inconsistent with their respective religious traditions. Historically, that is actually what happens, and even the unchurched mystics regularly debate the value and trustworthiness of various types of mystical experience. The point here, though, is that Nietzsche, at least in the last decade of his career, adopted this mystical intuitive epistemology, and this is the key to interpreting and reconciling the many paradoxes of his mature thought. In the words of Charles Ondler, in the same way as with Spinoza, the pantheistic state of his sentiments pre-existed his system and his geometric form, thus with Nietzsche, mystical ecstasy preceded his scientific reasoning. Okay, so now for Nietzsche's own mystical experiences. Given that mysticism is characterized by an epistemology privileging direct, intuitive knowledge through lived experience, or by what James calls a noetic quality, it follows as a matter of course that most writers, artists, and historical figures routinely described as mystics have or claim to have had powerful mystical experiences that transform their view of reality. Nietzsche is not ordinarily considered a mystic. But one of the reasons I argue that he ought to be so considered is that he certainly had at least two major mystical experiences. The first and most important in Sils Maria, Switzerland in August 1881, and the second in Rapallo, Italy in February 1883. All of the cardinal motifs of his subsequent mature thought, the Superman, the eternal recurrence, the will to power, arose out of these experiences, which he mentions in contemporary notes and letters, and even in his published writings. In Ecce Homo, in fact, Nietzsche describes the first experience in Sils Maria in great detail. The thought of the eternal recurrence, he writes, belongs to August of the year 1881. It was jotted down on a piece of paper with the caption, 6,000 feet beyond man and time. I walked that day through the woods of the lake at Silvaplana. I stopped next to a mighty pyramidal block of stone piled up not far from Surley. Then this idea came to me, or is it Surley? Excuse me. A few sections later, he provides a fairly elaborate phenomenological account of the experience, which for him is the prototypical experience of inspiration, in language very familiar to scholars of mysticism and to mystics themselves. And this is all the German is my translation here. So, does anyone at the end of the 19th century have a distinct conception of what poets of strong ages named inspiration? If not, I will describe it. With the slightest residue of superstition left in one would in fact hardly be able to reject the notion that one is merely incarnation, merely mouthpiece, merely medium of overwhelming forces. The concept of revelation, in the sense that something suddenly, with ineffable certainty and subtlety, becomes visible, audible, something that convulses and overturns one to the depths, simply describes the facts. One hears, one does not seek. One takes, one does not ask who gives. A thought flashes up like lightning, with necessity and fully formed without hesitation. I have never had a choice. An ecstasy whose tremendous tension sometimes unleashes itself in a flood of tears, during which one's steps soon involuntarily rush, then involuntarily flag. A complete being outside oneself, with the distinct awareness of a multitude of subtle shivers and trickles down to the toes. A depth of happiness in which the most painful and dark thing does not act as antithesis, but rather as conditioned, required, as a necessary color within such a profusion of light. An instinct of rhythmic proportion which spans a wide realm of forms. Length, the need for an extensive rhythm, is almost the measure of the force of an inspiration, a sort of compensation for the strain and tension. Everything occurred in the highest degree involuntarily, but in a storm of freedom feeling, of absoluteness, of power, of divinity. The involuntary nature of image, of metaphor, is the most peculiar thing. One no longer has any conception what an image, what a metaphor is. Everything offers itself as the nearest, the most real, the simplest expression. It really seems, to recall a word of Zarathustra's, as if the things themselves approached and offered themselves as metaphors. Here all things come caressingly to your speech and flatter you, for they want to ride on your back. On every metaphor you ride here to every truth. Here all words and word shrines of being burst forth to you. All being here wants to become word. All becoming wants to learn to speak from you. This is my experience of inspiration. I do not doubt that one must go back thousands of years to find anyone who may say to me, it is mine also. And then in a letter to Peter Goss, dated August 14th, 1881, Nietzsche clearly refers to the Sils Maria experience. Quote, thoughts have ascended on my horizon, the likes of which I have never seen. Ah, my friend, sometimes the notion runs through my head that I'm actually living a highly dangerous life, for I am one of those machines which can burst. The intensities of feeling make me shudder and laugh. Already a few times I could not leave the room for the ridiculous reason that my eyes were inflamed. By what? Each time I had wept too much in my wanderings the day before. And indeed, not sentimental tears, but tears of exultation, in which I sang and spoke nonsense, imbued with a new vision, which I have in advance of all mankind. The reason Nietzsche describes this ecstatic visionary episode in the chapter of his autobiography devoted to Thus Spoke Zarathustra is because it is the story of Zarathustra, the origin story of the basic conception of the work, the idea of the eternal recurrence, the highest formula of affirmation that can possibly be attained, unquote. Not only is it a direct product of Nietzsche's mystical inspiration, but he is convinced that it lies at the heart of the mystery faith of the Greeks. It is also the Nietzschean teaching par excellence, and Thus Spoke Zarathustra is a literary encapsulation of his entire mystical philosophy, which he was to unfold in all of his subsequent publications, and which is synonymous with his mature thought. If, to use Nietzsche's own metaphor in Ecce Homo, Zarathustra was conceived in Sils Maria in August 1881, the actual birth occurred suddenly in Rapallo in February 1883, following 18 months of pregnancy. The interim between these two mystical experiences, Nietzsche explains, belonged to the gay science, which in the penultimate section of Book 4 contains the fundamental idea of Zarathustra, namely the eternal recurrence, an idea he hints that was delivered to him by a, quote, demon. The figure of Zarathustra, however, is absent from the gay science for the reason that, as he further explains, it originated at Rapallo. Also missing from the gay science is an explicit use of the term Superman, for this idea only fully crystallized through the Rapallo experience, 1883. According to de Lubac, the significance of the Rapallo experience is that it showed Nietzsche with certainty how to interpret for himself the revelation given to him at Sils Maria. This may sound strange to the ears of many Nietzsche scholars, since the eternal recurrence, the primary content of the Sils Maria experience, and the Superman, which came to him at Rapallo, are typically seen as standing in a relationship of tension or even contradiction. Yet, as I will show, such seeming contradiction is more properly understood as mystical paradox, which is part and parcel of the mystical epistemology that is the key to interpreting the post-gay science Nietzsche. Now, the concept of apotheosis. Before we consider how this mystical epistemology reconciles the eternal recurrence with the Superman, the two cardinal teachings of the mature Nietzsche, a few more remarks are in order to support my contention that Nietzsche was a mystic and to show that he was a particular kind of mystic. The academic study of mysticism is, understandably, preoccupied with the development of typologies intended either to classify mysticism per se or to differentiate particular forms of mysticism according to the various phenomena that present themselves to the consciousness of the mystic. James's typology, one of the earliest and still arguably the most influential, is of the former sort. That is, it's a list of the distinctive psychological features that accompany the mystical experience and set it apart from other types of experience. The four marks of the mystical state of consciousness, according to James, are ineffability, it cannot be described in words but must be directly experienced; noetic quality, it conveys revelatory knowledge and accessible to the unaided, quote, discursive intellect; transiency, it lasts at most an hour or two; and passivity, the mystic feels as if his own will were in abeyance. All four of these characteristics are on full display in Nietzsche's descriptions of the experiences at Sils Maria and Rapallo. A fifth characteristic, which is also nearly universal to the mystical experience as presented by James in the Varieties, is unity, or what Rudolf Otto calls identification, in which the experiencer's sense of personal identity merges with the absolute, or with what Ralph Waldo Emerson calls the oversoul, the ground of all experience or consciousness. This characteristic is also integral to Nietzsche's post-Rapallo philosophy. The ego is 100 times more than merely a unit in the chain of links he scribbled into a notebook. It is this chain itself, completely. And again, we are more than the individual. We are also the whole chain. The notion of a unified ground of all existence underlying the world of differentiated forms and beings appears in Nietzsche's first book, The Birth of Tragedy, and the opposition between the Dionysian and the Apollonian, which in turn was influenced by Schopenhauer's opposition between the unitary and timeless reality of the will, on the one hand, and on the other, the principium individuationis, the principle of individuation, which Schopenhauer identifies with the Hindu-Buddhist concept of Maya, illusion. In his notebooks, Nietzsche defines the Dionysian as temporary identification with the principle of life. And he asserts that the highest state a philosopher can attain is to stand in a Dionysian relationship to existence. It is crucial, however, to make a distinction between the sort of unitive mysticism of Nietzsche on the one hand, and that of Schopenhauer and a related class of mystics West and East on the other. Nietzsche inherited from Schopenhauer the idea that the will is the ultimate reality. Life itself, he writes in Beyond Good and Evil, is will to power. Nietzsche also concurred with Schopenhauer that eternal becoming, endless flux, quoting Schopenhauer, are inherent in the essence of the will. In their response to this condition, however, Nietzsche and Schopenhauer were diametrically opposed. Whereas Schopenhauer prescribed the complete relinquishing of the will and therewith of the ego and indeed of existence itself, Nietzsche, through his capstone teaching of the eternal recurrence, advocated the total affirmation of life/will as the antidote to Schopenhauer's nihilism. In a section of the third book of the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche rails specifically against this decadent ascetic form of mysticism, which he attributes to the, quote, Hesychasts of Mount Athos, that is, Christian mystics of the Eastern Orthodox tradition, and of Teresa of Avila, as well as to Vedantic and Buddhist practitioners. Such pessimistic religions call nothingness God and seek deep sleep as attain unio mystica, he writes. In opposition, Nietzsche offers his life-affirming amor fati mysticism as a vehicle for a kind of self-divinization based on exalting the individual self or ego and identifying it with reality or God. The type of man conceived by Zarathustra, the man who noetically penetrates to the terrible core of reality, becomes reality itself and contains all that is terrible and questionable in it. This type of man we've seen is elsewhere referred to as Dionysus. The last sentence of his last book reads, "Have I been understood? Dionysus versus the crucified." In a late note, he confirms that the former represents the religious affirmation of life, while the latter represents its denial, specifically as a response to suffering. Unlike the crucified or Christian man, the Dionysian or tragic man is capable of deifying. He deifies the world by deifying himself and thereby becomes the whole world. In both the Schopenhauerian, Vedantic Christian type of mysticism and the Nietzschean Dionysian type, the split between the world and the ego, between self and other, is overcome. But while the first path, that of a unio mystica through self-abnegation, is virtually paradigmatic in the study of mysticism, the second path, that of self-deification through the expansion and exaltation of the ego, is often considered antithetical to mysticism. As far as I know, Milne is the only commentator to both recognize Nietzsche as a mystic and to identify the distinctive character of his Dionysian mysticism in the, quote, strong affirmation of the ego. The term I propose to classify Nietzsche's egoistic mysticism is apotheosis, the meaning of which emerges most clearly when it is contrasted with theosis, a term most closely associated with Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Theosis is generically comparable to the category of selfless mysticism that Nietzsche deplores, and that it involves an altruistic contraction of the ego with a view toward union with God. A few commentators have tried to assimilate Nietzsche's mysticism with that of the Eastern traditions he explicitly disavows. And theosis, too, is apt to be confused with Nietzsche's egoistic mysticism, inasmuch as Orthodox authors, beginning with the early church fathers, also employ the language of deification. Writing in the 2nd century, St. Irenaeus explains that Christ became what we are, that he might bring us to be even what he is himself. Still more explicit is Theophilus of Antioch, who, writing in the same century, asserts that if man should incline to the things of immortality, keeping the commandment of God, he should receive as reward from him immortality and should become God. In the 3rd century, Origen, writing from the fringes of the Orthodox tradition, speaks of a union of divine and human natures in order that the human, by communion with the divine, might rise to be divine, not in Jesus alone, but in all those who not only believe but enter upon the life which Jesus taught. Over a century later, Athanasius declared that God became man that we might be made God. The 14th century Byzantine theologian Gregory Palamas, perhaps the most renowned exponent of theosis in the Orthodox tradition, echoes his forebears in asserting that God's intention was that our nature should become like God. Not only is Gregory the best-known mystic theologian in the Orthodox tradition, he is also credited with the doctrine that distinguishes theosis from apotheosis, namely the essence-energy distinction. Although the doctrine was already implied by earlier fathers like Athanasius, who declared that God is outside all things according to his essence, but he is in all things through his acts of power, i.e., his energies. While God's energies are distinct from his essence, they are nonetheless expressions of God in his fullness, and uniting with them constitutes a genuine mystical union. In the words of Maximus the Confessor, we are called to, quote, consort with God and become gods. Thus, the Orthodox saint achieves theosis by participating in and uniting with the energies of God, never his essence, which is utterly transcendent and thus beyond all potential knowledge and experience. The purpose of apotheosis mysticism, by contrast, is to identify with God's essence, to transform the individual self or ego into God. The preliminary to this is the repudiation of any ontological principle, above all the Christian conception of God, that categorically denies the possibility of becoming God. If there were gods, exclaims Zarathustra, how could I endure not to be a god? Hence, there are no gods. The religious instinct for Nietzsche is identical with the God-forming instinct. What replaces God is the Superman, or man's deifying self-transcendence of himself. Dead are all gods, Zarathustra declares. Now we want the Superman to live. And again, once one said God when one looked upon distant seas, but now I have taught you to say Superman. Thus, as Jeffrey Kripal persuasively argues, Nietzsche is better understood not as an atheist, but as a godless mystic. For, as Nietzsche notes, it was God who killed God. That Nietzsche himself unraveled into a caricature of apotheosis is clear from his so-called insanity letters and from other testimony of his mental collapse. God is on the earth, he trumpeted. I have just seized possession of my kingdom. And I'll go on, that's from, you can see the letters that these are for. One of them is to Wagner's wife, the next one. His widow at the time. It is just a prejudice that I'm a human being, he wrote to Cosimo Wagner. Among the Indians, I was Buddha. In Greece, Dionysus. A frightful scene awaited the theologian Franz Overbeck when, in January 1889, he traveled to Turin to retrieve his insane friend, who was frenzying at the piano and spouting, quote, unspeakably horrific things about himself as the successor of the dead god. Carl Jung's posthumous diagnosis of Nietzsche as a psychotic is based precisely on this identification of the ego with God, or with what Jung termed the self. It's noteworthy that Nietzsche signed these letters alternately Dionysus and the Crucified. In the same breath that he declares himself Dionysus victorious, he claims that he also hung on the cross. Evidently, the psychological opposition between the ego deifying Dionysus and the ego destroying Christ had collapsed, a development that might have been expected in the psychic unfoldment of a mystical philosophy that conceives of the individual self as the totality of all things. Every name in history is I, he wrote to Jakob Burckhardt, who was a well-known cultural historian and was a colleague of Nietzsche's at the University of Basel. Okay, so Intuitio Mystica. The ultimate identification of Dionysus and the Crucified within the crumbling psyche of Nietzsche is actually a typical instantiation of another feature that is nearly universal to apotheosis mysticism, one that Jung termed the conjunctio oppositorum, the union of opposites. I offer a fuller presentation of the typology of apotheosis mysticism elsewhere, but it must be emphasized here that what James calls the noetic quality of mystical consciousness is highly pronounced in forms of mysticism that revolve around the deification of the self, so much so that Nietzsche can declare in a post-Rapallo notebook entry that, quote, the actual purpose of all philosophizing is the intuitio mystica, that is, mystical insight into the ultimate nature of reality, as opposed to some rational insight. This new epistemological foundation is indicated in the new prefaces he composed in 1886 and 1887 for his old publications. Here, as Tyler Roberts notes, invoking tremendous moments or elevated states plays a crucial role in his writing. Indeed, the first sentence of the 1886 preface for the gay science characterizes the book as an experience that demands similar experiences to be understood. The philosopher, as Nietzsche defines him in Beyond Good and Evil, is one who constantly experiences, sees, hears, suspects, hopes, and dreams extraordinary things. His thoughts are not the product of abstract reasoning processes, but come to him as if, quote, from the outside, from above and below, as a species of events and lightning flashes peculiar to him. Nietzsche believed that his own mystical experiences, in particular the breakthroughs at Sils Maria and Rapallo, had given him a godlike and hence historically rare insight into the inner nature of reality. The primary philosophical expression of this insight is the eternal recurrence, but the Superman is no less grounded in the same mystical source of knowledge. On the surface, however, these teachings stand in opposition. The eternal recurrence contains the idea that one's entire life, indeed all lives and all events, have already happened in precisely the way they are unfolding now, and that they will happen again and again this way in an endlessly repeating cycle. As the supreme act of life affirmation, one must not only believe, but will this to be so, to will that one's life, with all its terrors and joys and boredoms, occur again and again forever, without the least alteration. But the idea of the Superman involves the augmentation of the will, of the power of the will, in order to create new values. So how is it possible for the will to create new values, or to introduce novelty of any kind, within a fixed cycle of events entirely determined by fate? The solution to the paradox is in the transformation of personal identity implicit in the characteristic of a unity or identification that is integral to apotheosis mysticism. The will to power, being life itself, encompasses all things. And the goal of Nietzsche's Dionysian brand of apotheosis mysticism is divinization of the ego through identifying with this ultimate reality, with the principle of life. Paradoxically, the achievement of apotheosis entails the loss of a sense of individual identity and the transfer of this sense of identity to a depersonalized whole. From the perspective of the individual ego, the force of fate that rules supreme in Nietzsche's universe represents the ultimate impediment to the will. It negates the individual will. From the perspective of life itself, however, fate is the ultimate will to power, the ultimate imposition of the will over all of reality, i.e., over the will itself. The Superman coincides with the eternal recurrence because the Superman is fate. In the words of de Lubac, who also argues for the mystical rapprochement between these otherwise mutually incompatible teachings, Nietzsche can henceforth pronounce without hint of a lie the words amor fati, because he can first say without hesitation the words I am fate. So the unit of experiences that produce these convictions find philosophical expression, as Kripal notes, in some form of dual aspect monism, according to which reality is ontologically or fundamentally one, but epistemologically or experientially two. And this is what the mystical epistemology is really claiming to have one of the key insights it's claiming to have. While James rightly emphasizes the mystical experience of unity has, quote, no specific intellectual content whatever of its own, and is thus capable of forming matrimonial alliances with material furnished by the most diverse philosophies and theologies, he nonetheless finds a strong philosophical affinity between mysticism and philosophical monism. Beneath all apparent duality, then, is an actual unity that is split in two when filtered through the mind of the merely individual, non-divinized ego. How, in Nietzsche's case, this avoids his critique of decadence, which for him consists basically in the fabrication and idealization of a false world and the consequent devaluing of the real, i.e., physical world, would require a lengthy discussion of Nietzsche's peculiar brand of materialism and how his philosophy collapses being into becoming. Suffice it to say that, from the point of view of such a mystical epistemology, the Superman and the eternal recurrence are, quote, two sides of the same mystery. And that was basically someone giving de Lubac's interpretation. Whether we should accept this mystical epistemology as a genuine source of knowledge or adopt any of the mystical insights allegedly arising from it are questions outside the scope of the present study. The most salient problem, however, is the apparent inability of this intuitive epistemology to differentiate between reliable and unreliable intuitions, i.e., to account for the possibility of intuitive fallacies. For while apotheosis mysticism, in contrast to churched forms of mysticism, is at once suspicious of institutional religious authority and even discursive reasoning, it is naively trusting of interior sources of spiritual illumination. A churched form of mysticism, like that practiced by the hesychists of Mount Athos, by contrast, regards all interior sources of spiritual illumination as inherently suspect, as imminently capable of imparting spiritual delusion, or what is called prelast in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. Only when mystical experience has been submitted to the combined authority of the scriptures, the church, and tradition can it be accepted as a genuine source of knowledge by the Orthodox mystic. Conclusion. Nietzsche had two major mystical experiences that, he believed, gave him insight into the ultimate nature of reality. The two cardinal teachings of his mature philosophy, the eternal recurrence and the Superman, arose out of these experiences, and his subsequent philosophy consists largely in the unfoldment and working out of these mystical downloads. While the eternal recurrence and the Superman stand in opposition from a non-mystical, rationalistic perspective that takes the principium individuationis for granted, Nietzsche acquired both ideas from an inner source of knowledge that purports to transcend the principle of individuation, the world of duality or multiplicity, and reveal an underlying unity. The final goal of Nietzsche's mystical philosophy is identification with this unity, which is tantamount to deifying the individual ego, to becoming God, a form of mysticism I call apotheosis. The apparent contradiction between the eternal recurrence and the Superman is resolved through apotheosis. Fate or determinism is not, in the last analysis, inconsistent with the creative activity of the will to power, since the individual will to power is converted into the unitive will to power, the will to power writ large, if you will, that subjugates all individual wills and indeed constitutes reality itself. The purported knowledge of this, the intuitio mystica or mystical insight that Nietzsche says is the actual purpose of all philosophizing, is coextensive with apotheosis. One is the unity insofar as one knows that one is the unity. This knowledge reveals the apparent contradiction between the eternal recurrence and the Superman to be an artifact of the unenlightened discursive intellect that posits an ontological separation between the individual and the whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett. Fantastic. There's going to be so much to discuss. I have, I think, 5 or 6 questions that I want to ask you and turn to in earnest concerning the material that you've presented here today on Nietzsche. But I think before we get into all of that, I wanted to see whether you'd like to take the opportunity to say just something about your dissertation as a whole and how exactly this particular material that you've presented today contributes to what that larger project consists in.
Yeah, good. I think that's important. I mean, Nietzsche is not the central focus of my research, but really he's such an important figure in intellectual history, right? That's what I do. I don't do history of philosophy. I do comparativism and I do intellectual history. Um, and I'm looking at transhumanism. So if you look at the intellectual history of transhumanism, Nietzsche is very important, not just for the Superman concept, but also for well, I'll call the postmodern turn, which Stephen can say a lot more about that sort of thing, continental philosophy. But Nietzsche is the fountainhead of what will become the kind of postmodern critical approaches. And what's going on there is a disillusion of our concepts of the self and other things that become important to transhumanism. So, and the other thing that Nietzsche passes on to transhumanism. He's not the only vector of influence here, but it's this theme of deification I'm talking about in the paper, which is I think what's really at the core of mysticism. I mean, in James's typology, he doesn't say that. I'm working out I work out my own typology a little bit more in the dissertation, but transhumanism, it's this theme of deification is right at the center of it. And if you think of like Yuval Harari, who doesn't identify himself as a transhumanist, but obviously is, right? His Homo Deus book, which has been so provocative, along with a lot of stuff he said at the World Economic Forum and humans being obsolete. And so you see all those themes coming together, right, that I'm focusing on. So yeah, Nietzsche comes in really as a vector of influence on transhumanism. I've also just happened to read Nietzsche a lot on and off. Hopefully not anymore, really, but I've read Nietzsche a lot on and off since I was 18, and I my undergraduate degrees in philosophy, and like a lot of young people got very fascinated with Nietzsche, and wasn't trying to come back to Nietzsche, but you do come back to him. I mean, he's part of the methods in the study of religion, frankly. Someone I quote in the paper there, Tyler Roberts, makes the case that Nietzsche is really the most important figure in our interpretation of religion. He's even though we don't say that, it's so anyway, that's my relation. That's my relationship to Nietzsche.
So I want to, in a moment, come to the question that's raised to my mind in some remarks of Jeffrey Kripal's that you allude to, I think at least twice in the paper, namely this distinction Kripal draws between what he calls atheism and quote godless mysticism.
Mhm.
I think that's an interesting distinction and something I want to delve into. But before we turn there, I want to ask you what your thoughts are about another phenomenon with Nietzsche. You've alluded to it, I think, numerous places in your paper, which is that there are many Nietzsches. One thing about Nietzsche is that his writing has been taken up in such drastically different and in some ways incommensurate interpretive directions. So I was wondering whether you have anything you would like to say about these other prevalent interpretations of Nietzsche, what you think of them, what you think maybe ultimately recommends your interpretation as being in some sense the best. I have here in mind um, in the philosophical world, Anglophone commentators, people like Brian Leiter and Paul Katsafanis, for example, interpret Nietzsche as a naturalist. They see is in some sense engaging in naturalistic epistemology and philosophy of mind. One question would be, what do you make of these other mainstream academic interpretations of Nietzsche? And then the sort of addendum is that one interpretation I was presented with early on in my undergraduate years was through a teacher of mine, Paul Miklowitz, who studied at Yale. He was deeply influenced by Derridian deconstruction, and he wrote a really interesting book, which you might actually, I think, find interesting, called "From Metaphysics to Metafictions," which tells the story of German philosophy from Kant through Hegel and then culminating with Nietzsche. And on Miklowitz's view, Nietzsche is a postmodernist. And, Paul actually thinks that Nietzsche doesn't actually have a view. He's just putting out various views, and he thinks the trick behind Nietzsche is that you're supposed to come to the realization that there isn't any such thing as what Nietzsche is saying. So that would be a postmodernist interpretation, of course. That's it.
Right.
That would undermine your reading that no, Nietzsche isn't a mystic. There could be things in Nietzsche that suggest he is, but somehow you're missing the point. So I wonder whether you have a response to that sort of deconstructive interpretation of Nietzsche's body of work.
Well, I'm glad I got the paper published because there seems to be a kind of imperviousness among philosophers to, to understanding, right, these I mean, what James is getting at, right, the mystical epistemology and what's really going on. And I would humbly recommend to people that I've cracked the code here that they're not understanding. But yeah, the postmodern thing is not very mystical, right? It's not very mystical. It's anti-mystical and in a lot of ways. Okay, so if I could say just broadly about Nietzsche reception history, when I look at how it tracked to transhumanism, it's really about the pre and post World War II reception histories of Nietzsche. The deification kind of Superman thing is pre World War II, and respectable commentators are supposed to kind of garble and obfuscate the concept of the Superman, quite frankly, and to defang it. And this began with Walter Kaufmann, to defang it various ways, dissociate it from the Nazis, symbols that. So in the paper that I published on Nietzsche and transhumanism and the agonist, I discussed that reception history a bit, and the how the transhumanists deliberately try to disentangle themselves from it. Now, who are people involved in that, or um, George Bernard Shaw and those kind of popular interpretations of Nietzsche. And honestly, Nietzsche was received. James didn't like Nietzsche. A lot of people who were kind of respectable intellectuals thought he was kind of deranged, but he was influencing kind of people on the far left and the far right who were intellectuals of less respectability and art. And yeah, I mean, the Superman of the comics, there is a vector of influence. We don't. So from an intellectual history perspective, I'm looking at it differently. I do so is I don't know if you call Nietzsche a postmodernist. He's the fountainhead of postmodernism. He does inaugurate this kind of thinking, so you can say that. But I think again, it's better to understand it. It's better to understand the origins of it outside of the postmodern tradition. So I don't think I wouldn't really sign off on that reading, but I frankly say that he starts the postmodern turn. I'm not an expert in continental philosophy. I've leaned on you a lot to learn about Heidegger and a few other Heideggerians. So, I mean, I know Foucault and I know some other people. I understand the influence of him on Foucault, for example, and the life as an aesthetic phenomenon and self-crafting. And so Nietzsche is it's important in sort of dissolving a sense of the concept of man and the human and the self, and that's a major influence on postmodernism. I do think, but I see how people read him as a physicalist, and because he really you can't disentangle yourself from that reading, and I tend to think that Nietzsche's mature thought is basically consistent. It just has to be understood in the terms that I'm offering. I'm not saying it's without problems, but I don't think it just has no meaning, or it's just full of antinomies and paradoxes that you can't resolve. I just think he can't resolve that because of the interpretive lens that he's looking at Nietzsche through.
Thank you. Do you want to say something about this distinction Greipel draws between atheism and godless mysticism? I think in a way this is a provocative thesis because it sort of flows out of this discussion we were just having about how there is a prevalent strand in Nietzsche scholarship or Nietzsche studies that tries to emphasize Nietzsche's presumed naturalism, or as you say, physicalism, as a way to kind of evacuate any sort of apparent relic of superstition or the non-physical. And so for readers who are interested in taking that view, they want to claim that Nietzsche is an atheist. And I would take it that there's a sense in which Nietzsche is an atheist if we just define atheism as an absence of belief in God or the denial that God exists. And yet, nonetheless, Kreipel, who's aware that that's the common understanding of atheism, draws this distinction between atheism and what he calls godless mysticism. Do you want to say something just by way of sort of summation about what that distinction amounts to?
Well, that opens up another crucial subject, and I think the word here is immanence, right? That's not Jeff's term, but how Nietzsche can sort of insist on the physical nature of reality, while at the same time, he's called a vitalist at times too, and other things, right? Because he's reducing. It has to do with immanence, right? With and what I call the immanentization of the transcendent, which of course is I'm getting that from the Eric Voegelin derived notion of the immanentization of the eschaton, whereby Christian apocalypticism in the 19th century and before that and after is translated into kind of millenarian heaven on earth projects and impulses. And there's something similar, right, that's going on with Nietzsche. Now, so with Jeff, what Jeff sees is that when Nietzsche declares himself to be an atheist, and so he's read that way, and but what is this really consistent, and what does he mean by this, and why is he saying it? And he says other things that aren't really consistent with that, including a lot of the passages that speak to self-deification, that adopt a religious language, very comfortable in adopting a religious language in a way that middle of the century beret wearing philosophers didn't like to do at the time. Although now it seems there's more of and I think I see that in like critical post-humanism and stuff. There's a more willingness to take up religious language again and appropriate it, whereas before there was a distancing. Nietzsche is kind of all over that, but he definitely declares himself to be an atheist. However, Jeff is looking at it as a comparativist, as a new comparativist, and he sees that Nietzsche seems to be, he obviously has had what seem to be mystical experience. He's describing these hallmark kind of psychological features of the experience, and the world transforming into meaning, and his will being in abeyance and being in ecstasy, and at least the sense that he's discovered the secret to everything, and nobody's in Nietzsche thinks he has this historically rare insight. Nobody's had it before. I mean, you can go to Arrowhead or whatever, read people's psychedelic experiences too, and find stuff that less poetically written that has a lot of these features, quite frankly. So if you're a comparativist and you compare these things, you see that, and there are many other reasons to as I make the case here too, to read him as a mystic. And so what do we make of the atheism? And actually what Jeff's saying turns out to be similar to what de Lubac is saying, although they're not on the same page in their views of Nietzsche. Jeff's very pro-Nietzsche. De Lubac's very anti-Nietzsche mysticism. They both see him as a mystic. They both appreciate those that feature of anti-theism, of needing to get out of the way the old conception of God to make way for this. So that this is a criticism that you'll often hear coming from the New Age spirituality and pseudo Eastern spirituality, or I don't know if it comes from actual Eastern spirituality. It's all filtered through a kind of, I don't know, the Western New Age discourse that I was once a heavy consumer of. And one of the criticisms of Christianity you get is that, Jesus is deified, and that sort of blocks the deification of everybody else. And I think that's kind of the point of view here of Jeff, is that Nietzsche's getting the God man out of the way so that man can become God, and that's the anti-theist impulse. And de Lubac, I think, is saying something very, very similar. But of course, I think where Nietzsche's coming from is it comes from a false view of Christianity and Christian mysticism. I try to present what the actual view is, and the deification is actually part of the tradition, but that seems to be unknown to Nietzsche, incidentally. So he's read more seriously as a critic of Christianity and modern Christianity, but it's not clear to me. His father was a pastor, died early, and he was exposed to Lutherans, but it's not clear to me that he knew a lot, right, about the Christian tradition, or had looked at the fathers and stuff. I mean, he spent a little time as a classicist, but I don't know how deeply read he was in that. I don't think he knew any. He does refer to the Hesychists of Mount Athos, so he had some awareness, though, of the Eastern Orthodox tradition.
Thanks. I have a number of other questions, so thanks for your patience. Um, I wonder whether could you just, as simply as you can, restate what in a way is the fundamental paradox that you're focusing on here today, namely this apparent tension or contradiction between what you call his cardinal teachings, in his later period, the doctrine of eternal recurrence or the eternal return, and then the Superman. Do you want to just again explain what the seeming contradiction is? And then, of course, the idea is that Nietzsche's doctrine of the Unio Mystica resolves this. And once you've said a little bit about that, I want to just then try to put a little bit more pressure on the claim that he has resolved it, just because, again, we get into these paradoxes about the will to power and willing, and the connection between the individual will and this larger will. So I wonder whether or not there's a sense in which Nietzsche arguably resolves this paradox, but in a way in which we don't really have the kind of freedom that most people are still inclined to think must be the case for the contradiction to be genuinely resolved. And part of this has to do with issues that I want to get into in a moment about why is it that Nietzsche is writing? So what is it exactly that Nietzsche is trying to communicate, or what's the purpose of his communication? I have some thoughts about that I want to hear from you as well. But just for now, this point of the discussion, if you might just restate the seeming contradiction, how his idea of the Unio Mystica is supposed to resolve it, and what you make of this apparent tension that may still persist insofar as the individual will is in some sense an illusion. See if you have some thoughts about all that.
Okay, well, I mean, the contradiction, is basically that the doctrine of the eternal recurrence, which in some notes he tries to actually offer a kind of proof of, but it's often read as being a kind of thought exercise whereby you affirm, you see that if you're actually life affirming. No, I think he thought somehow it was baked into the inner nature of reality, and it's something like the eternal recurrence is such a recurring feature of religious and mystical thought that I think that's, to me, that's further evidence, right, that it did in fact come from an altered state experience of some kind. But this idea that everything is not going to change, can't change, everything's going to happen in the same way over and over and over again, right? And but the Übermensch, the Superman, is sort of about, however you read this, right? It is about cultivating a higher will and imposing one's will, and creativity, right? And introducing change and novelty through the will. I think that's indisputable. That however you read that, it involves that. So those just don't seem to be compatible. But what you have here, it's just an example of mystical paradox. I'm not, I mean, maybe you can't ultimately reconcile. Maybe you have some kind of deeper spiritual fallacy going on, but both ideas are derived from the same kind of intuitive source. It was the same patterns of thinking that produced them. I do think that the Superman gave him the kind of key to interpreting the internal recurrence. It's what adds the kind of that element of individual deification of the will to the equation. Um, so I think what you're dealing with are the kind of contradictions that to the, to the discursive, to use William James's term, to the discursive intellect, a lot of things in Hermeticism and in Kabbalah and so forth, they just don't make sense to the discursive intellect. It's part of the reason that it doesn't take it seriously. And I think that may be the case here with Nietzsche. It's kind of funny that some people that but it's the way that the kind of what I said, the protean and provocative style that Nietzsche wrote, in a way, right, it alienates him, but it also, people who once he gets sort of put in the canon, right, it gives people an alibi for reading him in spite of the contradictions. And Nietzsche himself famously said, right, that his small, I don't know who it's famous, but very humorously said that his small errors, right, are worth more than all the great, or his big, or whatever, his errors are worth more than all the little truths of all the little men. So, needless to say, if you read it, I definitely think, yes, Nietzsche he was deeply inflated. He had some kind of, I don't know if he was like that in his personal life, but you can see through the persona of his writing and through what happened in his psychosis, which may have had something to do with a brain tumor. There's some different theories on it. I don't think it was syphilis, but you can see the inflation, and I do think that's related in a way I can't explore in the paper. I do think that inflation is related to the mystical ideas that he's expressing through his work.
Yeah, I wanted to come, of course, to a question I think everyone will have, which is the question of his madness. So you just sort of touched on that. Now I'll raise that question again in a moment. Um, so just to explain to the audience why a lot of philosophers have found what Nietzsche is up to, the metaphysical picture, as it were, that he's presenting in his later thinking, why they've rejected it as incoherent, is that one of these little men, as Nietzsche might call them, would be someone like, for example, Robert Caine, who was a very prominent Anglophone philosopher who specialized in the question of free will and determinism. And one of the Robert Caine passed away yesterday, as it happened, or this weekend, as it happens. But Caine was famous for trying to revive what's called libertarian free will, which basically is the view that genuine human freedom would have to consist in what he calls free will, liberty, the possibility to do otherwise. So the idea is that determinism is incompatible with free will. So the way that the Caine would run the argument would be to say that, well, if we're in a deterministic universe, then given the laws of the universe and the initial conditions of the universe, then everything follows by necessity, including our own choices, which then, from Caine's perspective, are illusory choices. They're not genuine choices because, as a matter of agency, one isn't in a given circumstance able to exercise his will other than the way in which one does. And so for Caine, this means that free will would not be possible. So Caine then comes to the conclusion that determinism must be false if we're to be free. A lot of commentators have tried to argue that to the extent that Nietzsche's view of human agency and freedom fits within the typical topography of views, he's certainly not someone who believes in libertarian free will. But they also might claim that he's not a full-blown determinist either. They want to claim that he's maybe something like a compatibilist. I tend to think that that's not the case. He probably is this full-blown determinist or fatalist, and this is what kind of drives these deeper paradoxes that you're getting at today. Is what is the status of human freedom, or what we consider to be human freedom, in light of these sort of cardinal teachings, as you mentioned. Again, the problem, just so the audience is clear, is that if you think at a particular given point in time, I make a choice to do A or to not do A, or to do A or to do B, then the problem is, given the cyclical nature of time and the doctrine of the eternal recurrence, there's a sense in which whatever I will has always already been willed, right? An infinite number of times in the past and always will be again in the future. So this kind of puts pressure on the idea of the very coherence of what it would mean to will in that situation. If there's a sense in which at any given time, whatever it is that I take myself to be willing has already been willed. There seems to be a kind of necessitation to our action. But I want to turn now, if we could, maybe to the question of what is it that Nietzsche is trying to do in his writing? So you had mentioned at one point in your paper this distinction between the philosopher and the mystic, which I think also tracks a difference in discourse or the kind of writing that one associates with the philosopher or the mystic. So in mystical literature, I mean, a mystic can be writing for more than one reason, and not all mystics take themselves to be writing for the same reasons. So there are mystics who, for example, write spiritual manuals. And there, the idea is that the reader accompanies the mystic through a sort of spiritual journey. And there's techniques of meditation and prayer, whatever other spiritual exercises that one performs in the course of working through this written material that the writer, the mystic, takes will aid the reader along whatever initiatory journey it is that the text is meant to take one along. That, in some ways, is a considerably different kind of writing or genre of writing that what you would find in many philosophical texts. So, is there, uh, a philosopher traditionally is thought to be in the position of trying to persuade somebody by rational argument or not just mere rhetoric or something like this, nor is the philosopher just reporting on experiences he's had. Supposed to be a kind of intersubjectivity or universality or a sort of reason that's at work. So, given Nietzsche's cardinal teachings being what they are, and given what we know about what Nietzsche has said about his understanding of what those own experiences revealed about himself and the nature of reality, how then do you understand Nietzsche's literary output? What exactly do you think he's trying to accomplish in writing to his audience? Is he writing for himself? Is this just a form of self-exhibition, a part of the exaltation and the deification of self? Or is he in some sense trying to persuade readers, in which case maybe these paradoxes arise in a somewhat different context?
Well, I mean, that's a pretty weighty question. I mean, the insight I can offer is that he definitely sees himself, at least from a certain time period, as a prophet of some new age that's coming, some grand and terrible new age, right? There's and Jung was having kind of prophetic intimations after this as well. Not comparing that directly, but I mean, yeah, I think it's important to know that Nietzsche is an evolutionist. Um, he criticizes Darwinian evolution because he thinks it's shallow, like British thought, right? The idea of survival of the fittest. It's really about his idea. Evolution is driven by the pursuit of power and the feeling of power. But he's an evolutionist. He's interested in all of the kind of evolutionist thought, as I call it, of the era, both the esoteric and the Darwinian secularist thought that's going on. So he sees himself as a prophet of a new era. The Superman is an evolutionist concept, and he sees this, and he's not the only person. I'm sort of putting him in conversation with, like I think wider cultural and intellectual intuitions of the time that, the age of electricity and all the things that were happening in the last quarter of the 19th century, I think we're feeding into. But yeah, he saw himself as a prophet. I can say that about his writing. Jeff, a lot of my advisors work as on sort of reading and writing as a form of mystical practice as well. And Zarathustra is a character, related to Zoroaster, and Nietzsche explains something about the origins, but he refers to Zarathustra. Zarathustra becomes like part of his life. you can tell this, right? It's not just a book that he wrote. Um, so I think you could go a lot of directions with what is the purpose of Nietzsche's writing. One of the purposes is to kind of announce uh, what's to come, right? The thing that's to come.
Yeah, so maybe my final question, I think, just to piggyback on what you've said here, this idea that there's a kind of uh, self-conceit of being a prophet in Nietzsche's own understanding of his life and his work and what it is he's trying to communicate. I don't think necessarily to his contemporaries, but for future readers, for a new age. Um, Recently, when I was finishing my concluding chapter to Finding Meaning, the volume on nihilism that I edited, I came across a document that people attribute to Crowley, in which Crowley claims that Nietzsche was a member of the OTO, which I guess is a little somewhat anachronistic insofar as the different versions of the OTOs wouldn't have necessarily been in existence during Nietzsche's day, but there was some sort of esoteric community of some kind that Crowley himself sees as having existed at the time in which Nietzsche would have been a member. Do you want to say something about the Crowleyan dimension to Nietzsche's thought? I know I've mentioned transhumanism, but uh, what role do you see Nietzsche's philosophy playing in shaping what Crowley called this new age? And I think here again, you're in a position to say something about this because of your work at the Decoding Culture Foundation, your work on PSYOP Cinema, and your interest in cultural engineering. What kind of influence do you see Nietzsche exerting right now today in popular media and popular culture? And what's your assessment of the contribution that he's made to art and other media?
Well, yeah, all those questions are wrapped up in the pre-World War II reception history of Nietzsche, which culminates in the Third Reich's reception of Nietzsche, and then you get Walter Kaufmann resanitizing Nietzsche and liberalizing Nietzsche, and then you have the post-World War II reception history of Nietzsche. But the pre-World War II reception history of Nietzsche just went underground, into popular media, into forbidden or less scrutinized realms of thought, and it's become enormously influential, right? It's all around us. It's kind of belaboring the point even to make that point. It's kind of all around us. Now, for Crowley saying that Nietzsche was a member of the OT, you're more likely that Crowley is going to try to conscript people into mystic, because that's part of what with and people, I don't know if students know some of this, but in the late 19th century, there's this rise of occultism among the British elite and Order of the Golden Dawn, and people like a lot of poets and a lot of people in the intelligentsia, you might know, I won't list them all, are become part of this milieu. And one of the things folks like this do, they construct mystical lineages. So like the way that the Masons trace themselves back to the Templars. And we don't know, and a lot of this isn't historical, but I think what's going on, or I have reason to think what's going on, is that they recognize the same sort of current of spirituality and things in the past. They construct these mystical lineages. So what's going on there is Crowley, I think, is just conscripting Nietzsche into his mystical lineage, because there's obviously an affinity between Crowley's "Do as Thou Wilt" and the Superman, and the crudeness of it is the crudeness of the analogy is not accidental. I think that's the problem. Is a lot of sophisticated commentators of Nietzsche, beginning with Kaufmann, have talked themselves out of the obvious. I'm thinking, like, if you read Kaufmann's translations of the genealogy of morals, I mean, like that footnote where he's trying to explain away the blonde beast quote there is almost humorous to watch him backpedaling. And no, Nietzsche's trying to evoke the most terrible images deliberately. I quoted a very good German intellectual historian named Baumer in the paper, who yes, I think has a much better read of this. I understand it's what does he call it? It's the sort of recklessly experimental Franklin Baumer, I believe. It's the recklessly sort of experimental mode in Nietzsche that is what will go on to what is undeniably an influence on Nazism, and that's, again, that comes out of evolutionism and the spirit of this island of Dr. Moreau, spirit of Dr. Frankenstein's spirit of experimentation of that era.
Let me just, if I may, give one example of where I think Nietzsche's philosophy has been really influential in mainstream popular culture. Here I would look at the example of Christopher Nolan's films. So I have just two specific examples that come immediately to my mind where I can see Nietzsche quite clearly seeping in Nolan's films. One instance would be The Dark Knight. So one key feature of Nietzsche's thought, or a key feature of Nietzsche's thought, is his perspectivalism, or this idea that there's the necessity of lies, that illusions are somehow necessary, can be even life promoting or life affirming, and that the will to truth is this sort of relic of a Christian worldview that we have to dispense with. You see this, I think, in Nolan's Dark Knight, the idea that Bruce Wayne should be lied to, and that he shouldn't really be told the truth, and that it's good for lies to be spread, that there is a noble lie, and that I think Nolan is very much Nietzschean in this idea that the truth can be bad and ugly, and that because the truth is bad and ugly, we need to live by illusions. We need to live by myths. That's a very Nietzschean thought. The other idea here would be in a film like Memento. I know you and I have talked in other contexts about this move to anti-essentialism in the history of philosophy. And this obviously plays into the where we are now with the advent and the rise of transhumanism. But in a film like Memento, what I think you see going on in effect is the idea that Nolan is telling audiences that because there is no such thing as a fixed self-identity or no genuine objective truth about who one is or who one ought to be, in light of facts about who human beings are, of human nature, living in an illusion is not only inescapable, but something that we ought to affirm. And so the protagonist in Memento, I think the upshot here is that he's living a lie, but Nolan wants to say that in some sense, this is what we all do. And it's just that the protagonist in Memento is living just a very extreme sort of theatricalized version of what the human condition, in this sense, actually amounts to once you come to terms with the fact that there are no facts about human nature, or there is no actual story about a kind of human nature or human essentialism. I think that that clearly is another example of Nietzsche's residue in popular depictions of the human condition as we currently see it portrayed. I don't know whether you have any thoughts about those particular films or anything else in general, but I just thought I'd mention that when it came to mind.
Yeah, I see Nietzsche's. So, yeah, one very salient example of Nietzsche's influence in arts and entertainment, media, 20th century on is this thing I call the cult of the artist that we kind of take for granted, but it was really in its modern form. It was kind of taking off in the 50s with the the worship of some of these writers like Kerouac and people like that. It wasn't just beatniks, right? I mean, Kerouac was on television, intoxicated in people's living rooms, on shows, and everybody, like your average square person, they thought he's okay. He's an artist, though, right? He's a special person. He can get away with it. And there's this license that you got from being an artist and being out there. And but anyway, part of the cult of the artist revolves around this quintessentially Nietzschean idea that life is an aesthetic phenomenon. And that goes to these issues of truth, because he declares in Beyond Good and Evil, a very problematic passage for everybody who tries to interpret Nietzsche, that I'm not interested in truth. I'm interested in what is life affirming. Um, so, and I'll come back to the Nolan thing because I think that's a little bit. I think there's more Plato and classical republicanism going on with like Dark Knight, but yeah. So in the cult of the artist, it's this Nietzschean idea, which Foucault takes up in a different way, of subjectivation and self-crafting and as a site of resistance to power. That's the later Foucault. But that idea of life is only really justified as an aesthetic phenomenon, because that's like something beyond truth. If you don't have religion, you don't have reason, truth, it's got to be something beyond. And it's not, or, it's got to be something beyond just sort of animality and feelings and emotions. And I think we found it, right? It's art, right? It's Wagner or Francis Ford Coppola or right? It's the artist, the cult of the artist, and the artist also gets a special place in society. He's not subject to norms, but the artist is also the sad clown. The artist is also not taken seriously. The artist is also a kind of a controlled person, creature as well. But that's a different subject. So Nietzsche very much influences heavily the whole cult of the artist around the entertainment industry, I think. And that in the Dark Knight, with the themes of the noble lie, of course, is something in Plato's book two of Plato's Republic. The term comes from, and the idea that the idea here that like Leo Strauss and others have hit upon and played up as being very central to the political philosophy of Plato is that you have to have a founding myth. Like you can't run a polity on the truth. People have to think it has noble origins. They think it has to have religious origins. They think the laws have to come from gods and so on. So there has to be noble lies involved, including some kind of noble lie that's a founding myth. And that's the idea being played with in Nolan's work. Christopher Nolan, I think, is very close to the national security establishment and people like that. Anybody who's way up there in Hollywood is, and a lot of his movies touch on these themes that are preoccupations of those kind of people, and you see all of his kind of showing off of text. So cryptocracy. So it's the theme of cryptocracy, rule in secret, I think is the term I would use for the theme here. And I know we're running out of time. I could trace that cryptocracy, the importance of that back to Reinhard Koselleck and Carl Schmitt, and sort of intellectual historians have understood how, and even Foucault, right, understands how modern society in its own terms can't really run out in the open, right? It has to run in the shadows, in the background. And so Batman becomes an embodiment for how it works in the shadows and the noble lie. And then you get to the next Batman film, The Dark Knight, we see, oh, the lies, they'll have some consequences sometimes. And so, yeah, we're running on an unstable economy of information and truth and lies. And I mean, I file a lot of FOIA requests just to try to get information on federal collaboration with movies, different federal departments with movies. And I mean, I just got the DEA just told me they won't even give me production assistance agreement. So I guess it's like a state secret. I didn't say that, but it's effectively a secret, like even this agency, like who they help make movies. The entertainment media you get is made with heavy collaboration with the feds, official and unofficial. But we don't know things like this because there's such a culture of secrecy and hiding things anymore. It's just routine to mark classification on things. So
Well, so I think maybe that's a good place to conclude. So I think anybody who found Brett's presentation today of Nietzsche interesting, again, you'll want to keep an eye out for this forthcoming publication in the Journal of Continental Philosophy of Religion. And I'm sure that Brett will be publishing other aspects of the dissertation in article form, or maybe he has the makings of a book here. So you'll want to be on the lookout for that as well. And then again, I highly suggest people check out PsyOps Cinema and keep an eye on the Decoding Culture Foundation. And then also, again, keep an eye out for this inaugural issue of Cultural Engineering Studies, which will be due out. Is it July, Brett? Or
yeah,
do you know yet?
in late July, issue one of Cultural Engineering Studies magazine, and we've got some great authors lined up.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation on Nietzsche today. It was really excellent, and I enjoyed it a lot. And there was a lot to discuss. Are there any final concluding thoughts you'd like to offer before we finish?
No, just thanks for having me, and
No?
hope the students will get something out of it.
Yeah, great. Thank you.